Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to what should be a fascinating program. And sometimes we can look at the good things that have come from this pandemic, and one of which is the fact that at nearly a moment's notice, we can get a guest speaker from anywhere. It's really an amazing reality of today's world. And I want to welcome Rena Nasar First, who is the executive director for campus affairs at StandWithUs, which is an Israel Advocacy organization. Hopefully we're all familiar with them. And this conversation came up. We every Monday and Wednesday, for those who aren't regulars, we do a lunch and learn where we talk about Israel's past, present, and future. And about a week and a half ago, an impromptu conversation began all about what's going on college campuses. And we had a nice discussion. And then I said, I once saw this movie, and we've shown it to our teens a number of times, called Crossing the Line, produced by Jerusalem U, all about the horrible anti-Israel, anti-Semitic things that are going on college campuses all over the country. But then we said, well, this movie was produced, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. I wonder what's going on now. Is it just as bad? Is it better? Is it worse? What has changed since that movie was made? So I emailed a contact that I have at StandWithUs, and she put me in touch with Rena, and the rest is history, and here we are. So I want to thank Rena for joining us, and I'm just going to read to you her bio that I found on the StandWithUs website. And Rena, you can let me know if any of this has changed or add anything you want. But Rena Nasar First has been with StandWithUs for 5 years and started as the Tri-State Campus Director. Her Syrian background has fueled her passion for Middle East affairs and interest in Israel. In high school, Rena participated in the Right On for Israel program and was recognized by the program organizers for her accomplishments on campus. Rena attended Baruch College, where she graduated with honors and a dual degree in journalism and Middle Eastern studies. She also wrote a thesis titled Confidence Building Measures, a New Look at an Old Frontier for Peace in the Middle East, and held internships with JCRC in New York, the Israeli Consulate, and the Foreign Policy Association. Rena served as founder and president of Baruch's Israel Club, Yofi, the youth organization for Israel. The combination of her campus experiences and her growth within StandWithUs inspires her to take the StandWithUs campus department to new heights. Rena currently resides in Brooklyn, New York, with her husband, Jason. So I want to thank Rena for joining us, and I'm very excited to hear what she has to say about what's going on campus. Everyone in attendance should know that we are recording this session. Hopefully nobody has a problem with that, so we can make it available to more people afterwards. And finally, I want to apologize in advance. I have 4 kids all on Zoom right now in my home. So if there are any glitches on my end, I apologize, but we will do our best. So Rena Nasar First, welcome to Congregation Lador Vador, and thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Can everybody mute themselves, please?
Yeah, I'll mute everybody.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me. It is so nice to see people other than my husband. It's very lovely. So thank you for having me. As Josh said, my name is Rena. I work as the Executive Director of Campus Affairs at StandWithUs. StandWithUs is an international Israel education organization. And at StandWithUs, we are inspired by our love for Israel, our belief that education is the road to peace, and our commitment to stand up for Israel and the Jewish people. To give you a little background about myself, as Josh said in my bio, I'm Syrian. My family's from Aleppo. I know I really look Middle Eastern, right? I have the total Middle Eastern complexion. My grandfather actually fled Syria along with a significant chunk of the Syrian Jewish community in the 40s when things started getting really bad. My grandfather himself walked by foot to Israel, found refuge there, and then immediately had to pick up arms to defend Israel in the War of Independence. Because my grandfather spoke Arabic, he was put as sergeant major in the Givati Brigade, but all the men in his unit spoke different languages. They had very few weapons, makeshift uniforms. My grandfather would constantly describe vividly how they were the minority and how it looked like the situation was really dire and how they really should have lost the war. But what he would always say is that they won by the hands of God, that in that war, my grandfather saw how God was protecting the Jewish people, protecting the land of Israel. My grandfather's heroism inspired me endlessly as a child, and I told myself, when I get to campus, I was going to fight for Israel, just like my grandfather had. I had known that campus was the next frontier for fighting for Israel. And so when I got to college, I started my own Israel club. I started Yofi, which means beauty in Hebrew, or beautiful, and also stands for Youth Organization for Israel. After I started the club, I put on all of these amazing programs about Israel's humanitarian aid efforts, about the flourishing LGBTQ community. And I felt like I was making an impact. I was fighting for Israel by teaching people about Israel. I then decided within my Middle Eastern Studies major, I want to take an Arabic language class. How cool would it be to be able to speak fluent Arabic with my grandfather, not just the curse words that I learned as a kid, and be able to hear more about his life through his native tongue. I noticed right away on my first day of class, I was the only non-Muslim in class, but it's okay. I was excited to meet new people. I had grown up in the yeshiva system, so this was a really exciting opportunity for me. Then within the first few words of the class, of the introduction, our professor said, Arabic is a beautiful language, rich in culture and history. It really defines the Middle East. Then she said, there's another language spoken in the Middle East, but that language doesn't belong there. And one day, if we're lucky, it won't be there anymore. And my stomach dropped. I had never heard anything like that before. This was the first time I had been confronted with anti-Semitism. It was my chance to really fight for Israel, to defend Israel, just like my grandfather had. I was the minority in the room. This was my chance to follow my grandfather's footsteps, and yet I stayed silent. I didn't have the courage, I didn't have the confidence, I didn't have the facts. Loving Israel is just not enough. It wasn't enough in that moment. Knowing that I cared so much for this country was such a huge part of my identity. It didn't prepare me for this moment. I went through the entire semester not saying a word. My anxiety would be through the roof every time I walked into that classroom. And it was a horrible experience on an otherwise apathetic campus. And so when I graduated, I told myself, I'm not going to let another student be in that same position where they don't have a voice, they don't even know where to go or where to start. That's really what inspired me to work for Stand With Us. This is how I'm paying it forward, by making sure that I'm helping students everywhere through our department, through our work, through our resources, to have a voice, to know what to say, to give them the skills, the tools, the knowledge, and the platform to stand up for themselves and defend Israel on campus. Every day when I wake up, I pray that this work will not be needed anymore. But after 6 years in the professional field, it doesn't seem like that's happening anytime soon. The Stand With Us campus department is really leading the front when it comes to engaging campuses around the world. We specialize in engaging, educating, empowering, and inspiring students of all different backgrounds, both Jewish and non-Jewish, to share Israel's story with their peers and push back against anti-Semitism wherever they see it. Within our campus work, we're currently active in the US, Canada, the UK, Brazil, Holland, South Africa, Australia, and of course, Israel. If anyone has any other suggestions of where we should expand to next, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm really here today to talk to you about what campus anti-Semitism looks like here and now, how it has evolved since the production of the Crossing the Line film, and how it permeates. Traditional forms of anti-Semitism, swastikas, scheduling exams on Shabbat or on high holidays, anti-Semitic slurs, stealing mezuzahs, those are all still alive and well, unfortunately. They're easy to identify and easy to demand action for, most of the time. But what we see more often on college campus, within that space, within that conversation, is that anti-Semitism comes through in the form of anti-Zionism. I want to be very clear in saying that genuine criticisms of Israeli policy, even of Israeli society, are not anti-Semitism. You can love Bibi, you can hate Bibi. You can disagree with settlements, you could believe wholeheartedly in settlements. Those criticisms are not just not anti-Semitism. Within Israeli society, they're welcomed, right? They say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Some people say 2 Israelis, 20 opinions. Israeli discourse around these issues is so vibrant and diverse and different. There's no reason why conversation around Israel in America can't be the same. But it's important to be able to identify when criticisms of Israel cross the line. In the film Crossing the Line, there's a really good litmus test of how to see when comments cross over into anti-Semitism. It's called the 3 Ds. If a comment demonizes Israel or Israelis, calls them monsters, Nazis, demons, when comments like that happen, you're basically isolating Israel or Israelis from the rest of the world. And then when something happens to them, people aren't as concerned. Like, well, they're bad people anyway, they deserve it. That's what happens with demonization. The second D is delegitimization. When people call Israelis white ethno-European colonialists, when they deny the very real, tangible roots that the Jewish people have in the land of Israel, their indigenous presence that is evidenced by archaeological artifacts too. And yet there's this big claim to say that this land was colonized by this group of people and it belonged to them and they took it. The third D is holding Israel to a double standard, where Israel is judged in a different way than any other country when it comes to protecting itself. We see this most commonly within the UN, where I think in 2018, 2019, there were maybe 20 resolutions brought against Israel. How many resolutions brought against Syria for the brutal civil war? 1. The scales are not equal. Using the 3 Ds is the best litmus test to understand when commentary about Israel or the Israeli people could be considered anti-Semitism. In the film, they talk a lot about Apartheid Week, where student groups will build a faux apartheid wall on campus. They're talking about the security barrier, but skewing it to say that this wall separates people. It's creating apartheid in Israel. They have mock checkpoints where they pretend to be Israelis, brutally abusing Palestinians coming in and out of this checkpoint. They bring BDS resolutions to student government, where they're asking members of student government to boycott or boycott Israeli products or divest from Israeli companies. All of these programming tactics are still very much alive and well among anti-Israel student groups on campus. And I want to just define those groups for you. We have SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, not to be confused with Sarah Jessica Parker, because if you Google SJP, you'll get both things. We have Students for Justice in Palestine. We have JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, which is basically the Jewish version of SJP. And we have INN, If Not Now, an organization that focuses specifically on boycotting birthright and other Israel experiences. What's so problematic about these organizations is that their titles sound so noble. They're fighting for social justice. They're fighting for peace. They're demanding change. They sound like grassroots organizations. But really, we know this is an orchestrated strategic effort that has national roots, that seeks to really poison the conversation around Israel. Aside from these student groups, you also have academia. You have faculty that have their own opinions and utilize their class time, utilize their platform to diffuse their anti-Israel or anti-Semitic statements or thoughts or opinions. Aside from groups like SJP, JVP, and If Not Now, they really don't work alone. Probably one of the biggest and newest challenges we're facing is intersectionality. I want to give you a bit of a definition of what intersectionality is, and then we can talk about how it impacts the Israel conversation on campus. Intersectionality is a theoretical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities, whether they be gender, race, class, sexuality, religion, combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege, which basically means me as myself, I have different identities. I'm a woman, I'm Jewish, I'm Middle Eastern, all these different identities I have help me connect with other people who have overlapping identities with me. If we follow this theory, if our overlapped identities lead to common oppressors, then it makes logical sense for the oppressed communities to join together to strengthen their fight for change. The anti-Israel movement has really taken on this concept of intersectionality and has harnessed it. It has truly become part of their campaign to delegitimize and undermine support for Israel. These activists insist that the Palestinian cause shares the same underpinnings as the same struggle for racial justice in America, for environmental justice, for LGBTQ justice. These efforts omit context. They never really talk about what Israel is facing, the security threats that Israel faces, or what it has taken to get to this point, or even the peace efforts that Israel has made to change things. It's all about the Palestinian cause and how other oppressed minorities or other oppressed communities, other social justice communities could be part of the conversation. In the campus space, what that means is they simply exclude pro-Israel students from any real conversation and lump them into this category of oppressors. Pro-Israel students on campus may have very real passions to fight for racial equality, to fight for environmental reform, improvement for the LGBTQ community. Whatever their passions might be, they're turned away from the conversation just by nature of them being pro-Israel. Basically, the conversation is either you give up this key part of your identity that's so problematic, or you just can't sit with us. It's demoralizing, it's humiliating, and it's isolating. We actually saw this most recently. We see it a lot, but we saw it most recently at NYU, where 50 student organizations signed on to boycott the 2 pro-Israel clubs on campus, Torch Pack and Realize Israel. This is a devastating reality for these student leaders, and I'm going to address this later in terms of how we combat it, but I wanted to first kind of explain to you what some of those challenges are. So this is one of them, intersectionality. Another challenge we're seeing, which is I'm sure you'll all find equally strange, is that there's this new phenomenon where there are others seeking to define anti-Semitism for us. People outside of the Jewish community who feel they have a right to define anti-Semitism, and even more so saying that we don't. At University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, a notoriously tough campus around Israel, the student government last year passed a resolution that said anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism. And they did that without any consent or any regard for the Jewish community. They didn't even ask the Jewish community. Imagine that, a minority not being allowed to be part of the conversation of what defines their oppression or hatred against them. Crazy to think about, because no other minority community would have this challenge. It's wild. The last newest challenge I'd like to highlight for you is the personal and vicious targeting of Jewish student leaders. We've seen this at McGill, NYU, Michigan, countless other campuses, most recently at University of Southern California, where student government vice president Rose Rich was forced to resign due to harassment for her pro-Israel views. It becomes this question of a student's loyalty or capability to represent the larger campus just because of their Jewish identity or pro-Israel values. If you think about it, that's probably one of the oldest anti-Semitic tropes in the book. Overall, what we've really seen in terms of an evolution is that the anti-Israel activity and crossing the line was loud, it was proud. What it looks like now is a lot more tactful. These movements are hidden behind the gauze of social justice, and have appealed to influencers in all fields to join the cause. So what do we do? What should we do? What can we do? As a community, the first thing we need to do is reclaim the definition of anti-Semitism. No one should be allowed to define that for us, and we need to make that very clear. We need to unify our voices and make it very clear that anti-Zionism is an important definition of anti-Semitism. It is one that cannot be overlooked, and we will not allow it to be overlooked. Our current push right now at Stand With Us is to have administrations adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which includes the 3 Ds and emphasizes that anti-Zionism should be properly recognized as anti-Semitism. We've seen progress so far, but we still have a long way to go. Stand With Us has a dedicated Center for Combating Anti-Semitism that empowers people of all ages to understand what anti-Semitism is and how we combat it. What I really like that the CCA has is it has an acronym. We have to have the right idea. We have to identify, D, define, E, expose, and A, accountability or action. We take action or we demand accountability. We have to be vigilant for wherever these instances of anti-Semitism crop up and know what our options are in terms of how to deal with it. What can you do? We need to be well versed on the issues. We need to know how to deal with them when they arise. Within our campus department, we teach students how to answer tough questions about Israel. We empower them with not only the facts, but the skills needed to know what to say, to feel confident in sharing the truth. We also teach them the history up until today, and not the history from 1948, not the history from 1967, but the history from 3,000 years ago, making sure every student we meet understands that Israel's story starts with indigenous roots 3,000 years ago. People say, don't preach to the choir, but at Stand With Us, we really believe that you have to make sure the choir's singing the right tune. The choir is all in the right key. I was someone who thought I was in the choir in college, but when it came time for me to sing, when it came time for me to speak, I didn't know what to say. So we can't ignore those who are so passionate and so connected. We have to empower them. We have to make sure they have the tools needed to stand up whenever that moment comes. Within our department, we have our premier Emerson Fellowship, a 1-year leadership program that trains students from over 150 campuses to bring proactive educational programs to campus. These students are mentored by our regional staff, and they work diligently to really change hearts and minds on campus. We support them and mentor them and guide them all along the way. Another thing we do is we teach students how to create genuine and meaningful relationships with other communities and clubs on campus. There's no reason why other groups wouldn't be interested in learning more. A lot of times, either they're scared to learn more, to get connected to the Israel students, they're bullied into not wanting to learn more, or they can't even see the connections in their head. So we help students by giving them the tools to create those meaningful relationships, to be able to do that effective outreach, so that these other communities and clubs can see that there's a ton of overlap in interests and values, that these students aren't scary, they're interested in the same things you are, and that's how real connections build from there. We also empower students to run for positions in student government, so that when the conversation comes up, when a BDS resolution comes to student government, our students have a voice. They're in the room when the conversations are happening. When BDS campaigns are brought to campus, we help students analyze resolution text. We help them prepare speeches, create effective messaging and strategies. And when students are dealing with anti-Israel or anti-Semitic professors, we connect them with our legal department so that every student can understand what their rights are in the classroom and what actions they can take to protect themselves. I'd say most of all, though, while all these different strategies and resources are so important and are keys to our success in our work, probably the most important thing we do or that we focus on in terms of a strategy or an approach is rather than getting people to do something for Israel, rather than getting them to come to an event, sign a petition, buy sabra hummus, whatever it might be, what we need to do, what we do at Stand With Us and what we need to do as a movement is show people how Israel can do something for them, how Israel is impacting the world in so many ways, and as it trickles down, it's impacting their lives. Our approach to Israel education is to make it personal, to connect to people's values, and to help them get some skin in the game, to help them understand why they should care. There's this concept that we heavily believe in. It's called the 10-80-10 rule. You might hear the 5-95, 10-80-10. It's all derivative of the same concept. Within an average group of people, and on an average college campus, you might have 10% of students who are pro-Israel, the choir that we want to make sure is reinforced and everyone's singing from the same page. You have 10% of people who are anti-Israel. For whatever reason, these people will not change their minds. They are staunch in their opinions. But then you have this middle 80% that really doesn't know. They really don't care. They're not interested. What's interesting, though, about this 80% is although they don't care, they know they should. They know if someone asks them about Israel, oh, what do you think is going on in Israel? They should have an opinion. No one wants to seem like they're not aware of what's going on. No one wants to seem like they're not keeping up. So what happens to the people in the 80%? They end up piecing together opinions from things they read on social media, things they might see on the news, a one-off comment they might hear from a peer, or something they might hear from a professor. And they take these little pieces and create some sort of patchwork opinion on what's going on. Patchwork opinion on Israel and the conflict. That's our opportunity, this group of 80%, this 80% majority. They know they should know something. They know they should have an opinion. So what we do is ensure that our students are engaging with that 80%, that we are engaging with that 80%, so that we give them real information to go off of and allow them to be more informed about the issues. There's a few programs I want to highlight that really demonstrate this concept. One of them is a lemonade stand. One of the programs we have, we bring this big lemonade stand to campus. There's nothing Israel about it. It's just bright yellow fun. No flags, no falafel, no camels, nothing. Just a lemonade stand. And we invite students to come get free lemonade. We ask them, hey, have you ever heard of the expression, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade? Most students say yes. And of course, who wouldn't be intrigued by free lemonade? They come to the booth, they come to the stand, and we tell them, are you familiar of the story of Israel and the Jewish people? Some people might say yes. Some people might say maybe. Most people say no, not really. That's our opportunity to engage. What we tell them is that Israel's story and the story of the Jewish people is a story of turning lemons into lemonade. It's a story of being exiled out of our homeland, living in diaspora, and then finally returning home, reclaiming our liberation movement, and building up this tiny country to contribute to the world in so many ways. That's how we turned lemons into lemonade. And then we take it a step further by making that personal connection for that student, by telling them, so what lemons do you have that you want to turn into lemonade? How can you get inspired by Israel's story to overcome whatever challenges or adversities you have or you're facing? Students have this big plushy lemon with a chalkboard on it, and they can write down their challenges. Passing chemistry, finding a job, whatever it might be, supporting my family. We're giving students an opportunity to show how Israel can inspire them, how Israel is lifting up their day, and how within our interactions, it's not about Israel, it's about them. They are the hero of their own story, and Israel's just helping along the way. The most common reactions we get to that program fresh water. That's bringing Israel to the people. This is how Israel is constantly helping the country in real time. We're looking forward to expanding this project even more and doing it on campus, off campus. Another thing we do is bring people to Israel. We have a trip called Project Insight, where we bring student leaders who are non-Jewish to experience Israel for themselves, meet the people, see the places, and then form their own opinions. We actually had someone who came on one of our Project Insight trips. His name is Sebastian, and he came on thinking, this is not for me. This is super, this is going to be all propaganda. It's not really going to impact me. I'm going to go on just to see what it's about, and I'm going to try to poke holes in it. He actually came on the trip with bad intentions. He left the trip feeling completely moved. He was blown away by what he saw, by what he experienced, by what he heard, by who he spoke to. Sebastian came back to campus completely reformed and actually ended up working for StandWithUs for a little bit. And right now, he's working for the Israeli consulate in the Southeast. This one trip showing him how Israel connects to his values completely changed Sebastian's trajectory, completely changed his life. It's moments like that that are going to have the impact. And it's got to be on a small scale in the sense that it's got to be affecting individuals, but it's got to be scalable. It's got to impact the whole world. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. I'd say most importantly, out of all of this, the main thing we need to do to combat anti-Semitism, the first step we need to take is to remind students that they're not alone, to remind community members that they're not alone. Whenever someone is dealing with anti-Semitism, they have an entire organization like StandWithUs behind them. They have you all behind them. You're all here because you care so deeply about this issue. They have you behind them. They have a global movement behind them, ready to support them and fight alongside them to combat anti-Semitism. When I give talks like this, the most common question I get is, well, you know, I'm not a student, I'm a parent or I'm a grandparent. So what can I do? What role can I play? I'd say the first step is get your children or grandchildren connected to us. Let us start to provide them with some of those resources. We have a high school department that prepares students before they get to college. And we have a middle school department that offers a curriculum before students even get to high school. We'll make it younger and younger as we go based on the need. Maybe you want to get involved with Connect for Progress. Maybe there's an issue you see in your town, in your city, and you want to do something about it. Maybe that's how you can get involved. Maybe you want to join ACF. We work extremely closely with an incredible organization called Alums for Campus Fairness. The organization organizes and mobilizes alumni and creates chapters at different campuses to really influence change when it comes to anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity. As much as galvanizing students is powerful, you know, it's more powerful, money, right? Money speaks louder than words. Alumni have a real ability to impact the way an administration does something. So maybe the way you can get involved is find an ACF chapter for your campus. And I'm happy to make that connection. Where you went to school, how you can get more involved. Maybe you just want to educate yourself more. All of these resources that I shared are not just available to college students. Of course, my experience and my work is through our campus department, but all of what we offer is available to everyone. I would say at StandWithUs, the mission drives everything we do. It's so important, but we all need continued support in order to continue with our mission. So if you're interested in learning more about our organization or getting involved, please let me know, and I would be happy to connect you to the right people. Overall, the fact that you're here listening to this talk and wanting to do something about it is giving me real hope. And as much as I paint a grim picture, there are incredible things happening on college campuses. There are incredible student leaders who are organizing amazing programs. Through StandWithUs's work alone, we engaged over 60,000 students last year. We would have engaged more had it not been for COVID, right, which completely shut down all the campuses. But this important work is happening constantly. The tides are turning. It's a slow change, but it is going to happen. And we're excited to be part of that conversation. I know that was super quick, but if anyone has any specific questions about anything I shared or anything I didn't share, I'd love to take them.
Well, I want to thank you, Rena, for a very, very informative conversation. I have a number of questions, but I'll let other people have a chance as well. But I just wanted to ask you first. You mentioned that the tide is turning, and that was one of the questions that came up in our discussion, because we are a little optimistic, a little hopeful that maybe the whole tide of the Middle East is turning with the signing of the Abraham Accords and, you know, lots of other positive developments that we're starting to hear about. I know it's very recent, but do you know if that has had, or do you expect it to have, any impact on the whole experience on campus?
It's a great question. We haven't seen positive impact, but we haven't seen negative impact. And what's really interesting about the work is we kind of have to judge by what we don't see as well as what we do see. So we're not seeing people protesting this. We're not seeing people or college students, leaders speak out against it. So that already is a good sign. There isn't much to pick apart there, because if you want to say you're speaking on behalf of the Arab world, and the Arab world is moving in the opposite direction than what you want or what you envision or what you believe, it's going to look pretty inconsistent to kind of talk about it that way. So by not seeing any real pushback, that's already a good thing. I think even more so, this change in the Middle East is going to really impact that 80%. They're going to understand that there's something here. There are common values, there are common interests. The people themselves in these countries are so excited for this connection. So this place must not be that bad. There must be something to it, and I want to learn more. I think if anything, it's intriguing those in the 80% to want to learn more.
I think that's great. If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. You'll have to unmute yourself. And I guess we'll start with our rabbi. Rabbi Yafi, go ahead.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you for a beautiful presentation. I'm curious if there's any energy or effort of Stand With Us to stand with the Justice for Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace and faculty members that have been known to be anti-Israel. Is there any energy or effort that can be or could be done to say, let's talk, let's sit down and let's have a dialogue, not in a big way, but in a quiet way? Because I think that although it's 10%, 10% can do a lot of damage. And I'm wondering, because so often, and we just heard about this, what's going on in Colombia, and they just passed the BDS, and the whole article that was written in the Colombia newspaper, written by Jewish kids in favor of Palestine. Where is the energy, or is there energy, or could there be energy to say, let's talk?
Definitely. That's a great question. Before I address it, there's a question in the chat from Eva that I'll address afterwards. I just don't want to forget, and I want to let Eva know I saw your question. What's interesting is that these anti-Israel groups, SJP, JVP, they have a very strict anti-normalization policy, where they say we won't even normalize communication with Zionists. We don't even want to entertain the idea of having a conversation. That in and of itself is so problematic. And what we see through these intersectional forces that they're driving, there will likely be campus clubs that want to follow suit, that will say, we're going to adopt this anti-normalization policy too. One of the trainings we do at Stand With Us, it's called Across the Spectrum. where we invite students to have conversations with each other about things they very clearly disagree on. Different statements about Israel, separation of church and state in Israel, or shul and state in Israel, right? Separation of religion and state, or if it's about settlements, if it's about Israel and the West Bank. We offer these statements and we give students an opportunity to have difficult conversations and to actively disagree with each other. We have them set guidelines, basic expectations of how they want the conversation to go, how they're going to be respectful of each other despite those different opinions. And then we let them run with it. We let them talk, we let them discuss. It's an incredible exercise that gives students patience. It gives them understanding. It gives them clarity. It gives them a bit of perspective from someone who thinks differently than them. These are all tools they could use to engage with some of these students. When the students on the other side, within that 10%, have this anti-normalization policy, all these tools that we give our students will mean nothing. If no one shows up to the conversation, there's no conversation to be had. But some of our students are so persistent that they get through. We had this also at McGill, actually. Last year, they brought a delegation of all different types of Israelis, an Arab Israeli, a Druze Israeli, a Christian Israeli, a Jewish Israeli, to campus to do a tabling event, to just talk to people casually as people are walking by. And the head of the McGill SJP, it's got a different acronym, but same idea for the club, came by, and the students actually had an amazing conversation. They were able to speak respectfully. They were able to have really impactful dialogue. They didn't agree on a lot of things. It's not like they came up with peace for the Middle East, but the fact that they were even able to have that conversation is incredible. What ended up happening afterwards is that this student, the head of SJP, contacted our student leader at McGill and said, let's start a club to just have dialogue. Let's bring together Israelis and Palestinians, pro-Israel students and pro-Palestinian students, and just have conversations. And it'll be just for us. It's not meant to convince anyone of anything. It's just meant to see where we can meet in the middle. It's amazing. I'd love to see more of it. We hope to see more of it. Education, conversation, nuance, perspective, that's what's going to change things. That's what's going to move the needle. Our students are prepared to do it. I think the ask now is among that 10% to be willing to have that conversation. Eva asked a great question about Title VI, about filing Title VI. It's a legal case about discrimination. An administration or a campus is discriminating based on a number of different categories. One of them being anti-Semitism, right? Targeting the Jewish community, or now the pro-Israel community because of national identity. Stand With Us has actually filed a Title VI claim against UCLA for failing to protect students on campus, specifically failing to protect an individual in a classroom who was being horribly harassed by her professor, horribly harassed. But it's only one of many instances at UCLA where the administration failed to protect the students. So we're currently waiting for the Title VI investigation as it's happening. It's something we filed against UCLA. There was also a Title VI filed against NYU. And they found that NYU was guilty of not protecting its students. So now NYU is reforming a lot of the different policies, bylaws, whatever it might be, to make sure they're protecting Jewish students. Title VI is a very, very, very strong tool, and it's one that we are not shy to use if we find that administrations are not yielding to these very important demands for the Jewish community.
Any additional questions? Go ahead, Naomi.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first one is, have you done any research as to why or who the Jewish student, what the Jewish student's background is for them to be pro-Palestinian, as opposed to pro-Israel?
Yeah, I would say it really boils down to these students feeling like their Jewish education or their Israel education failed them. They were brought up thinking Israel's this perfect place that can do no wrong. It's this perfect country. And then the minute these students learn about real flaws within the country, just like any other country, they're disturbed, they're distraught, and everything they had been taught or they had learned, they feel is a lie. They feel they want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, get rid of all of it. What we really seek to do with the middle school engagement, the high school engagement, even our community engagement, is to make sure that students are getting a very real picture, and they're learning that if you learn about things that make you uncomfortable, that you're not that thrilled with, that's okay. That just makes you more patriotic. That makes you love Israel more, right? I love my husband to death, but I'd be the first one to tell you all the things I want to fix about him. I'd be the first one to list that for you. That's what genuine love and connection is. It's not surface level. It acknowledges the shortcomings and welcomes the great strides. So I think the biggest issue these students have is in their education, of not feeling they got something holistic.
I agree with you 100%. And I've been saying this for years and years and years. My second question, which you touched upon, is you talk about bringing it down to middle school and high school. Now, are you talking about middle school students in a temple or yeshiva setting, or are you talking about middle school children in middle school, public school?
I gotcha. A great question. Within our middle school department, the way they work is by establishing curriculums, different curricula that really help middle school students foster that strong connection to Israel. It's really taught through the lens of how they're learning every other subject in school. While our middle school department is largely utilized in yeshivas, in Jewish schools, Jewish day schools, they also are starting to tap into public schools as well, with interested teachers who want to take on this curriculum. In high school, our high school department really does a great job at reaching all students, public schools, Jewish day schools, youth groups, synagogues, however or wherever they are. We provide them with the different tools and resources to educate themselves and educate their peers. Within that department, we have a high school internship, where similar to the Emerson Fellowship, high school students are trained, and a lot of them come from public schools, and a lot of them themselves are not Jewish, but they're drawn to this work, they're drawn to Israel, they're drawn to the truth, and they want to be part of sharing it.
Are you reaching out to the conservative movement and the reform movement and the Reconstructionist movement? And I think it's great that you're in the yeshiva, because I think that's real important, but I think these other aspects of the Jewish community have to be targeted as well.
Definitely. We seek to provide resources that are going to make sense for any community, no matter how they're encountering them. We have, as an education organization, not even a Jewish organization, just an Israel organization, we are open to any and all who want to engage, and we seek to do that outreach all the time. Naturally, if we think about the choir within the Jewish community, you have the Orthodox community has very strong pro-Israel opinions. With the conservative, reform, reconstructionist communities, we want to make sure that we are accessible and available to all, and we actively do that outreach. But I would go so far as to say, if you have any communities, people, families that you think could use some of what we're doing, we'd be happy to get connected.
You have.
Could I ask?
Yes, let me just finish this last question, Eva, and then I'll hand it to you. Let me just finish the last question, okay? The last question is, because of the limited time that the children spend in a temple setting for education, how do you figure that you can bring this to the temples so that they can have at least an exposure to your programs and ideas?
I would say the easiest thing we could do is send booklets. We have booklets that are like the size of a, don't copy my information, but the size of a credit card, little booklets that you can carry around in your pocket. You might not know everything you need to know. You might skip the temple session that's on anti-Semitism. You might not want to get involved with your youth group. You might not be interested in any of these things, but just to have that booklet on you, the minute you need it, that will be the foray into all of this. So even if we can't physically speak to people in person or even through Zoom, students don't always want it. They're not interested in it. The minute they need it, if they have that booklet, that's everything. So it's just sometimes getting the community leaders those booklets, getting them the materials they need to then just pass them on to the students so that when they're ready to start the conversation, they know where to turn to.
I want to ask you, because a lot of what you're talking about, it's a wonderful program. I know Stand With Us for a very long time, but a lot of the Jewish organizations like yours are always defensive. I'm asking you, is there any way or any program that exposes Students for Justice in Palestine, intersectionality? In other words, a lot of students don't realize they're being conned by organizations that are pro-Palestinian, that are not democratic, they're national, they're destructive, and they're trying to destroy Israel. And if you're not going to let people know that, and you just say, oh, Israel is wonderful, let us talk to you about how nice Israel is. If they don't know the truth about what's going on in, intersectionality, including BLM, which you didn't mention, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in a lot of the organizations. They're very, very clever. And what I see lacking is a lack of expose of who the enemies are and that they don't belong on campus and they need to be litigated, as you said, now that we had an executive order that includes anti-Semitism in the Civil Rights Act, the Title VI Civil Rights Act, as we were discussing before. We need to have an assault on these people because the professors shouldn't be allowed to get away individually, not just the administration of a university, but individual professors should be, lawsuits should be brought against them. We have to intimidate the enemy because they are the enemy. They are the United States extension of the, Palestinian cause to destroy Israel. And if the students were to know the truth, there might be a different reaction. And I'm wondering why Stand With Us is not taking an aggressive approach against SJP.
So I appreciate your thoughts. Thank you for sharing them. I want to say first that when it comes to exposing SJP and how problematic they are, that's something that we heavily do. For the past 2 years, we've sent over 3,000 letters to different administrations talking about how problematic this organization is, outlining the different cases of anti-Semitism they've brought on, from the most minor to the most major. And most recently at Fordham, we actually filed an amicus brief. I'm not in the legal department, so I'll explain it as best I can. Basically, a few years ago, the Fordham Student Life was approached by students who wanted to start an SJP, and Fordham said, no, we're not going to allow this type of hatred on campus. That's not going to happen. They ended up getting responded to with a lawsuit from Palestine Legal saying you have no right to not allow these students to form a club. You have no right to do that. This case is still ongoing, but Stand With Us filed an amicus brief, which is basically providing additional information from our organization that supports why this group has no place on campus. We hope this will just build momentum from here. I'd say to further your point, Eva, we also have a booklet called Stolen Narratives. It's a relatively new booklet, but it's a very impactful booklet, probably one that has been years in the making, that exposes how the anti-Israel movement is co-opting these social justice movements and saying that they're natural connections, they're naturally supposed to be together. This booklet exposes all of that very simply, very clearly. From the campus end, we need to first get into the room to start the conversation. If someone won't let us sit at the table, you know what we're going to do with the chutzpah that we have? We're going to bring our own chair. You don't want to give us a chair, we're going to bring our own chair. No problem. Don't worry. And once we're able to start that conversation, once people see that there's a person talking to them and not, you know, the wing of the Israeli government or whatever they might think, that's when they can really enlighten that student with how problematic these movements are. It's got to start with that conversation, but once we're ready to have it, we have all those resources ready for the students.
Great. Thank you.
Nona, go ahead.
If you'd like a copy of that booklet, let me know. I'd be happy to send it.
I would.
No.
Yes, I would.
Rena, I know we're approaching 1:30. Are you okay for a couple more minutes? I think we're almost done. Okay. All right. Zona, go ahead.
Now, I had a question. We mentioned curriculum, and we know how important that is. Now, we know, I'm just wondering if Stand With Us is in any way investigating curriculum in different parts of the country. For example, in Newton, Mass, which is a very Jewish community, the textbooks were totally anti-Israel. It was unbelievable. And of course, it's been discovered. But I think recently in California, they've had that issue. So I'm just wondering, is there any way, I mean, outside of a parent noticing a child's book, but is there any way that Stand With Us can reach out and sort of get guidance on what is being written into the curriculum?
It's an important question. And to reference what you just mentioned in terms of California, basically there was this movement to have ethnic studies be part of California curriculum. And naturally, ethnic studies can be a downward spiral for anti-Semitism, anti-Israel propaganda. Our team actually worked tirelessly on pushing back against the ethnic studies curriculum. And it's something we might see in other places too. So we're keeping a close eye on it. We do our best to keep an eye out. We do our best to stay vigilant on Facebook for people's Facebook posts about these issues. People might tweet about these issues. They might write an email about these issues. They might tell their friends about these issues. They might tell their rabbi about these issues. We actually have a new organization that's getting started now called Rabbis United, bringing different rabbis together from all different denominations, to your question, Naomi, earlier, to unify in this cause. So however they're sharing this information, students or parents, about problematic textbooks, curricula, whatever it might be, we're seeking to find it. That being said, we can't be everywhere at once. So, and you know, our bandwidth we're stretched really thin. So we really rely on those we work with, we have the pleasure of working with, to share those things whenever they see them. And then we'll get the action team on it. So as much as we try to find it, we definitely need to rely on those we work with to also send it forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'd like to conclude with one final question. Rena, you mentioned that when your experience as a student in this Arabic class and the professor was spewing all kinds of things, do you think that today the average college kid, any of our children or grandchildren or whatever, would know a little better what to do on their campus if they experience such an incident? Would they feel that they have the at least nowhere to go when such a thing comes upon them?
I would hope that if a student was encountering the same thing today, that they would have had some sort of touch point with our organization, that they would know a little bit of what to do, a little bit of what to say. But I think for the most part, the onus is on us, whether they're our children, our grandchildren, our nieces, nephews. The onus is on us to make sure that this identity, this connection is so important. And this generation does not know what it was like to not have Israel. They only know Israel in its existence. Israel's here to stay. They don't know what it was like to get Israel. We have to make sure they understand what blood, sweat, and tears and losses, tremendous losses it took to get this country, and how important it is to protect, and that they are a key role in that. And while that sounds daunting, it sounds intimidating, we have to think of it as empowering. This is something that you can do with just a few words. You have the power to do it. You have the power to change someone's entire perspective. So if we reinforce our students with this idea, if we empower them with the facts, then when this moment comes, whatever the right way is for them to deal with it, I think they're going to do the right thing.
I'm so glad you said that, and I think that is like the most perfect way to conclude this session, because really with all that Stand With Us does, and with all that organizations like them do all over the world, it's really up to us in our own homes, in our own families, in our own communities to make the biggest impact, and bigger than any other organization could. I want to thank you so much for coming to help us understand what's going on with these issues and what's being done to combat it, and to give us a greater understanding of today's challenges. I want to thank you for all that you do and all that Stand With Us does, and we really, really appreciate your being here. And to those who have joined us today, whether you're regulars to our Monday and Wednesday class or not, we're going to continue the discussion on Monday at 12:30 as we resume our Lunch and Learn, and new members are always welcome, and feel free to join us. Thank you, Rena, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I've included my email in the chat. If you would like a booklet, just send me your address, and anything else, any other questions you might have, or please stay in touch. I gave you my email. I don't really
Thank you.
sleep, so you can email me at any hour.
Rena N
Good to us.
at
I don't know.
StandWithUs.com. Rena N
What is-
at StandWithUs.com.